Hey there, writing buddies. I'm Michael. Welcome to my channel, Mr. Swain. Today, I'm going to be talking about dialogue and how it's going to be able to help your story move forward. The first thing I want to talk about with dialogue is that you need to be looking at it as a tool. It's not something that just happens in writing. In our fictional worlds, everything is completely made up, obviously. So it's not just something that happens. It's something that you craft. In the same way that a chainsaw is crafted to cut down a tree and a flashlight is crafted to shine light on an area, dialogue is crafted to move the story forward and also give us information about our characters. It doesn't just exist, it does something. When it comes to dialogue, in a novel, you have to remember that you want it to sound realistic, but it's not really going to be realistic. What I mean by that is that, like right here, I just kind of paused. There's ums, uhs. I use filler words like just, maybe, sometime, like all those kind of things, right? I'll restart a sentence mid-sentence. Those are all realistic things in dialogue that you don't want to have in your novel's dialogue. Think of how when you're listening to a movie, all that dialogue is really cut down to the bare minimum of what is needed in the movie. When they speak, their dialogue is meant to move the plot forward, and you're really only going to get those ums and uhs and the breaks and the justs things when it's meant to convey something else. When it's meant to be like the person is uncomfortable, the person is super irate, so they can't even get their words out. They are, maybe they're hurt. Those kind of things can impact dialogue, and that's fine to have in your novel as well. But under normal circumstances, the dialogue should be trimmed down to what is going to be moving the story forward and nothing else. In other videos, I've mentioned that we want to be moving the plot forward with every single line that we have, and that goes for your dialogue as well. And that could be the main plot or a subplot, but typically dialogue is also going to be revealing other things as well beyond just moving that plot forward. The biggest way to keep the plot going forward, though, with dialogue is by having conflict. In my stories, what I always say is that the real root of conflict is always going to be in the heart of the individual, right? So it's yes, you're going to have big battle sequences in fantasy typically, right? Which is what I write. You're going to have, fights against the dragon. You're going to have armies marching against each other, whatever, right? But the real conflict is going to come between one person's views opposing another person's views. And sometimes, sure, that becomes a sword fight, but a lot of times that is just a conversation, heated typically, that is a conversation between two people. And in a conversation between two people where you haven't gotten to the violence yet, that is a very tense moment where you could have violence kind of hanging off to the side. That if this conversation doesn't go well, we're going to be coming to blows. Now, in less physical confrontation type of stories, so like for a romance, for instance, a lot of times the big conflict, the big climax is going to be verbal. It's going to be a verbal argument. It's going to be something of that nature where, instead of being, hey, are we about to fight right now? The question is, hey, are we about to leave each other right now, right? The question of a romance is always about will they, won't they? Well, through conversation, you start to feel that tension. If they're having a big disagreement and they're conflicting through their words, then the reader might say, hey, I don't know how these two are going to be able to reconcile after that argument. How are they ever going to come back together? One of the most typical uses for dialogue that people gravitate towards is going to be character development. If you watch my video on character development, then you'll know that I listed dialogue as one of the ways that you can really help show who a character is to the reader. By having them actually voice their opinions, it shows what they're willing to actually say out loud versus what they might hold inside themselves. So it really does go a long way with developing the character. Dialogue can also help define characters. If you're able to get your dialogue so on point with a character that you don't even need a tag, a dialogue tag that is, and people, like your readers, still know who's speaking, that is a great sign. You really hope that you can get there with just about all of your characters. And it's not going to be that way all the time, because some lines of dialogue are going to be kind of generic. But if you can have two characters having conversations with each other, or even multiple characters at the same time, and you still should put in dialogue tags or action tags, at least something that lets the reader know who's talking when. But even if you couldn't, or if you didn't, and the reader still knew who was speaking, then you're doing it right. That is a good sign. Now we know what the dialogue is meant to do. Let's talk a little bit more about how to actually write it. If you're finding this video helpful at all, please do give it a like down below. It really helps with the algorithm. And if you think someone else could benefit from this, please give it a like. I appreciate that. One of the most important things I think of when I'm writing someone's dialogue is their culture. Culture is typically going to give you a lot of verbiage, like what kind of words is this person going to hear? What kind of turns of phrases are they using? I remember in the Wheel of Time, what was her name? The Amerlin Seat, who starts the books off as the Amerlin, Sanshin, I think is what her name was. I can't quite remember, but she always used these fishing terminologies because she grew up in a fishing village. And I really liked that. I mean, you had to be kind of careful to not overdo it that much, but I really did like it from the way that it was done in those books. Anytime that you have a character who is really big into something. So for instance, one of my characters is very big into cooking. A lot of her references deal to cooking. My main character, he grew up forging weapons. So as a blacksmith, he uses a lot of blacksmith terms to define things and contextualize things. So depending on what culture, what kind of upbringing your character had, those kind of things can really contextualize and can really morph their language and how they speak to other people. Another question to ask when it comes to culture is the language that's being used in the book, is it their first language? So, if you're using like a normal world, for instance, obviously I mainly deal with fantasy, but if you're in a normal world and the main language that you're using is English, is this character, is that their first language? Or do they normally speak Italian? Do they normally speak Spanish? Do they normally speak Portuguese, right? All these possibilities kind of open up a different avenue as to how they might sound, the types of phrases they might use, the types of phrases they might not understand. So when they hear someone speak to them, and the other person uses a colloquial term, and they've never heard that before, they could get confused by that. So make sure that you do understand the person's culture, where they're coming from, whether or not they're very used to the language, whether or not they've heard these sayings before or not, and that's going to help go a long way in how they actually deal with dialogue. The other thing I always think about is masking. Masking is something that we all do all the time when we are not alone. Basically, when you are with anyone that you are not 100% comfortable with, you will have some kind of masking going on, right? This can be that you just kind of hold your tongue because, maybe it's a character with one of their parents and they don't use curse words around their parent, but they do use curse words around their friends, right? That's a type of masking. This could also be in the sense of, maybe you have a romance novel and the boy is too shy with the girl around that he stops speaking. So he just can't get his words out around her, so he just decides, I'd rather not speak and make a fool of myself, so I'm going to mask and just not talk. Or it could be the inverse of that. If the character knows that the girl likes when guys talk, he decides, you know what, I'm going to start speaking up more. But he only really does it when he's around her because he doesn't really feel the need to speak up more when she's not around. So he's only really doing it when she's there. That would be another type of form of masking. Masking often leads into the next form that I always think about, which is nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is what we often refer to as body language. This is typically going to be subconscious for the character, but they also might consciously do some body language. That does happen sometimes, especially when you have characters who can't speak against someone else. Maybe the other person's of a higher rank, of a higher authority, so they can't quite speak out, but they can still do body language type of things to kind of show that they're not really happy. In the example of the boy being shy around the girl, maybe he can't talk around her, but he does typically turn towards her. Whenever she's talking, or whenever she's part of like their little circle group, he's typically looking at her, he's typically facing her, he gives her more attention. Those kind of things are nonverbal communications that he's interested in her, which he can't quite get out verbally because he's too shy. One of the other things I think of often too is group dynamics. Now, group dynamics is in twofold. So the first one is a more technical term, and that is when it's talking about like a majority think versus minority think. So, you know, if everyone in town wears a hat, and you come into town and you don't have a hat, you might feel a little out of place, so you want to put a hat on. So in the same sense, you might have that kind of situation going on with your dialogue. This could come in the term of like colloquial use. If there's a turn of phrase that's used very often, then your character might adapt that because they've heard it so much, everyone kind of knows what it means. So they might start using that turn of phrase, which they weren't really using before. But since the majority of people use it, they're going to use it as well, so that way they can communicate more effectively. Other type of group dynamics is more about the dynamics in a smaller group. So a lot of times in my stories, I'll have it where, you know, you have a group of heroes going to, you know, defeat a dragon, defeat a demon, whatever, and there is group dynamics inside of this small group. Who's the leader? Who's generally regarded as the smartest? Who's generally regarded as the weakest? That is going to dictate how people speak to each other, right? The leader is not going to really take back talk very much because they need to keep their position of authority over the group. The person who is, you know, looking for advice is probably going to go talk to the smart person, right? They're also going to treat the weaker party member a little differently than they would the strongest member. So make sure that you understand the group dynamics that are going on in the smaller groups to really be able to, you know, hone in on that dialogue of whether or not my character would they really actually speak to the leader in this way, or would they kind of phrase it differently, maybe like soften the impact so it's not so challenging to their authority. Finding how your character speaks to others can be a very fun and engaging experience throughout the writing process. I enjoy dialogue a lot in books, mainly because it's characters connecting with each other or even conflict, but I really enjoy reading dialogue in stories because to me, it's getting closer to that heart of conflict. Let me know down in the comments below how you tackle dialogue. I'd love to hear it. Until next time though, happy writing, happy reading.